Good. Thank you. All right, so we're back. House Gov.Ops and Military Affairs here on Thursday morning, not Tuesday. And so what I'd like to do is pick up where we left off, Tim, and I believe our next set of changes is in section 10.
Thank you, Chair McCarthy. Yes, that is correct. Again, for the record, my name is Tim Devlin, Legislative Counsel. And section 10 appears halfway through page 7. And the first change I'd like to note is that we, let's see, the reader assistant heading now reads write-in candidate registration and minimum thresholds in primary elections. Of significance, what has been added here is added language to require that write-in voters receive the higher of 10% of the votes cast by the party plus one additional vote, or the number of votes as the same number of votes, that is, as the number of signatures required for the candidate's office on a primary petition. And then if no candidate is determined to be the candidate of party persistent to those two minimums, then the candidate shall be nominated by the party committee in accordance with other statutory language, but I'll go into the specifics now. So the first additional language appears highlighted in page 8 under subsection B, specifically subdivision 1, and then we add a subdivision 2. And subsection B reads as follows: a write-in candidate shall not qualify as a primary winner unless the candidate A has complied with subsection A of this section, and B receives the higher of I, 10% of votes cast by the party plus one additional vote, or II, the same number of votes as the number of signatures required for the candidate's office on a primary petition. Subdivision 2, if no candidate is determined to be the candidate of the party pursuant to subdivision 1 of this subsection, a candidate may be nominated by a party committee in accordance with subchapter 2 of this chapter. I'll pause there.
So the total effect here is we have a write-in consent form. So if you're going to be a candidate for a major party as a write-in, you file your consent form 5 o'clock the Friday before by 5 o'clock the Friday before. So that's the first piece. And then you have to win the higher of 10% of the votes cast in that primary, or for instance, if there were only, let's say, 200 votes cast in that primary, the minimum threshold is the number of signatures that you have to get to appear in that office. So for a legislative race, Tim, that's 50 right now, right? For a House race. So you have to get at least 50 votes. And if there were over 500 ballots cast, then it would be the 10%.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I'd agree with that. And
does that part make sense to everybody? I know there's multiple things there in that little section. All right. This this piece of the threshold was the reason that I felt like it was H97 was the appropriate vehicle. All right, Tim, let's keep going. Thank you.
Okay. Let's see. That is the last substantial passage of changes. Body of changes to be made, but there are some other things I'd just like to point out as we kind of scroll down. Let's see, section 12 on page 9. I apologize, this is not highlighted, but in subdivision 2A now reads, a vote for a write-in candidate shall be counted as a write-in vote that is without consent of candidate unless the write-in candidate filed a consent of candidate form with the Secretary of State in accordance with section 2370 of this title in the primary election subsection 2472B of this title for the general election in subsection 2702F of this title for the presidential primary. And I'll just pause there and say that this is a rephrasing of what had been there before, which was replaces the term generic write-in vote to provide more clarity and avoid ambiguous terminology. Moving on, if that's all right. The next change I'd like to point out is we moved the electronic ballot return sections to the end of the bill now amendment. You'll find those in sections 15 and 16.
Was there any change to the language from what we saw yesterday, Tim?
Yes, there is one slight change. There's a highlight on page 13. This is under the return of ballots language in Title 17 VSA, section 253043, that is, subdivision 2A. And this clarifies that all ballots electronically delivered pursuant to subsections 2539B or C. And again, that's for people, voters with illness or disability in B, and military or foreign voters in or abroad voters in C. And those electronically delivered ballots will be returned by means of a secure online portal developed and maintained by the Secretary of State and directly to the clerk before the close of business on the last day of the clerk's office. On the last day that the clerk's office is open prior to the election. And I'll pause there. That is the only new language in that section.
We had talked about that briefly yesterday. Anybody have any questions about the electronic returns language? Anything else we should know on this draft? Representative?
No, this is just a comment. I certainly can get behind the electronic filing provision in this bill. I'm concerned with the rest of it. I want to make sure that there's an opportunity for this piece to definitely get through. And I don't know how we can work that, but if I can go back to comment on Representative Hooper's scenario, as far as local elections go, I think a lot of times the folks that do get written in maybe aren't there, and they wouldn't have that opportunity the day of or the day before the actual meeting to fill out a consent form. They may come back from vacation or wherever it is and say, hey, and I just, that wouldn't give them the opportunity to say yes, is my understanding, if they didn't fill out that consent form, correct?
That's right. So the way this is written now, and Tim, correct me if I'm wrong, but the way this is written now, you have to affirmatively file a consent form in order to have your votes counted. And for locals, it's by the close of the polls. In the scenario that you bring up representatively, no, even a candidate who was written in but hadn't filed a consent form
Would not.
Wouldn't make it through. So that,
I know those are two separate things, but that's just my comments at this point.
yeah. All right, so I want to open it up for community discussion.
Just quickly, if you might, remind me, what's the timeline we're shooting for on this bill?
I would like to vote this bill out tomorrow morning. That's why I'm spending significant time on it today.
Sure.
And open to hearing folks' thoughts about each section of the bill.
Yeah.
We're going to come back to this afternoon and take it up tomorrow morning. If we haven't come to a place where I feel like there's enough support for the sections, I'm willing to move, but we have a lot on our plate. Next week's going to be huge in terms of the public safety stuff that we have to consider. budget. And so
Yeah, no,
I don't want to spend.
well, the reason I asked is just because I wouldn't support this bill as it sits right now. I can't, I thought I could be open to the fusion changes, but I'm not into it. And I'd rather it just get struck, but that's probably not something that you want me to say.
Could you maybe elaborate on the things that you're concerned about?
Well, it just feels like we're meddling with a Vermont tradition that happens pretty rarely. And this, there are cases in electoral history in this state where candidates were so popular that the other party wanted to express their support without being prompted. And this would remove that possibility entirely. And I'm not exactly sure why we need to do that, you know? I know that you're making the argument that this bill would heighten the integrity of elections, but I think it would simultaneously place emphasis on partisan politics in the elections process. And I'm never going to support that concept.
Is it specifically the need for a candidate to file a write-in consent that's your concern?
No, I mean, I thought that was probably a reasonable thing. What I'm saying is that you can't now, let's say I'm popular enough in my district with the Republicans that they wanted to express that without me having to like set it up that way, you know what I'm saying? That would no longer be allowed. I'm not saying that I'm so presumptuous as to expect that. But I'm saying that it's now not going to be possible if this, and I'm not talking about I don't care about my race. I'm saying nobody can have that happen. And I also don't really care about the fighting between progressives and Democrats in Chittenden County. It's not something that I think this committee should be addressing, but So I just
want to, before I go to Representative Nowicki, say that I have gone really out of my way to make sure that this bill's not about the fighting between Democrats and progressives in Chittenden County, including the provision that we spent some time on this morning about preserving the ability for candidates to say, you know, I want my write-in votes cast, or I want my nomination votes cast toward whichever party they want in order for major party status. So this bill is not about that. For me, this bill from the beginning has been about, I want the party designation to mean something. And even if we're just raising the minimum threshold, like that to me is like one of the key things. It was a key thing for the folks who sponsored 897, which is to raise the threshold. And the pieces around, you know, wanting to say that you should run for the party, you should pick a lane, you should run for the party that you really want to identify with. So that
I agree with this. Oh, sore loser part. Let's do that. Yeah, but you know.
So it really does, the writing piece, the piece where that seems to be the crux of your concern, Representative Cooper, if I'm understanding, because that's the mechanism that's causing the problem that you're identifying, I think.
I guess creating barriers to something that happens pretty rarely because you want to make certain that people are representing themselves accordingly when they seek public office. It just seems like a little bit of a disconnect. The context doesn't line up well enough for me, I guess.
Representative Wood.
Yeah, well, thank you.
And I don't mean, I appreciate
Excuse me.
doing what you've done.
Done?
Yeah, sorry.
Thanks. So thank you for all this sharing. It's a good discussion. And, you know, I keep going back to the Republican primary for Congress last year. And it's hard to describe what it was because we haven't seen anything like that before. And I don't want to certainly open the door for more of that. But I don't think this stops anybody from voting for who they want to in the general election. We're talking about the primaries here. And anyone from any party can vote for anyone once we get to the general election. So I don't see how that stops people from voting for you or for anyone. Done.
Representative Chason and Representative Hooper.
I think one of the things that I'm hearing from this portion is that people can still vote for somebody from Party A in Party B's primary, but this is asking that individual, the candidate, to approve that they want that label. So in your example that you used, if the Republicans in your district wanted to vote for you on the Republican primary, they could do so, but in order for that to be published, you just have to say, yes, I want that label.
Yeah, but you can still reject it. Like I could still say, no, I'm not a Republican, so I'm not gonna put that next to my name. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So it doesn't solve that problem, if you would even call that a problem.
Representative Hooper of Burlington.
Burlington.
Yeah, you said Burlington.
I heard Burlington.
Representative Chase has said something that threw me off a bit, but
Never.
the thing that, I've had a problem with the designation of the word candidate for a while. It has to be proactive. Everything in the world is not proactive. Is there a reason specifically that we would not say that somebody that came back from the Himalayas on December 1st, or no, back primary land, couldn't proactively say, I accept, as opposed to having filed first?
So I think that there's an interrelationship between two things that are in the bill. And what I'm coming to understand from this conversation is that the write-in portion, the write-in consent portion, the requirement for write-in consent, and the consequential, there are two big consequences of that. I've heard Representative Nugent be very clear that she feels like the name that is written in by the voters should be reported. And then the consequence that you're bringing up, Representative Hooper, if I understand it right, I want to really make sure I understand what the committee's saying around this before we come back this afternoon on this. What I'm hearing you say is that you really deeply believe that someone who is essentially by acclamation by the people of Vermont, the people of that in that primary, whichever election it is, where they come together and they say, we want Joe Smith to be the candidate here. Joe might be in the Himalayas, but he's an eligible candidate because his residency, et cetera, he meets all the other requirements, that he could accept the nomination for either the primary or even office. And the consequence of only recording and counting as valid the write-ins after a consent form it causes both of those things to happen. And so what I'm hearing real heartburn with that write-in piece, that's the real crux of both of these concerns. And I just want to say, I really am hearing it. And I started this and was really supportive of that proposal from the clerks. I put that in my initial committee bill proposal because I really deeply believe that you should have to do something affirmative in order to be a candidate. And I'm hearing some deep feelings about democracy and about what this process should be. And I want that conversation happening here. That's our job. When in our elections jurisdiction, what we do in Gov.Ops is to really deeply think about when we're asking the Secretary of State and the clerks to administer elections in a particular way, going so far as to say for the major political parties, you Secretary of State's office and clerks are going to administer these parties' elections because you're the only ones who are really fairly qualified to do that. How they do it matters to me deeply. And I'm hearing some real concern from the committee about this. So I want to want to think about it and process that, and talk about it a little more this afternoon before we kind of decide where we're going with this bill. But I really deeply hear it. So other thoughts, we've got a little time.
My concern, to narrow it down, is not the mechanics of it. It is the, oh crap moment that we open up the possibility for. That in the back of my head now, there's this little dog barking that says, gee, don't go there. And I can't put a finger on. I mean, if Bruce Springsteen comes and lives in the state tomorrow, there's a good possibility he'd get written in for anything. But we would, under this, say no.
Yeah. So I think that that's valid, and I want to sort of think on how we could preserve many of the things we want in the bill and maybe sort of move past this particular piece when we break for lunch. But I want to say that the oh crap moment we had in Franklin County that we talked about when I was really first pitching this bill was that somebody who got less than 5% of the write-ins, and we have wide open primaries. Who knows whether those people, whether they're Democrats, whether they just picked up a Democratic ballot to make sure that their friend or the candidate they supported was on there. That person ended up right after the primary had a big major thing happen that made it so that both major parties that he'd won the nominations didn't want him to be their candidate, and there was absolutely nothing they could do about it. And at least raising the bar a little bit, as we were doing with the minimum threshold increase, would make it a little bit more meaningful to get that second nomination, and wouldn't prohibit anybody, wouldn't prevent anybody from being on the general election ballot. So my key priority with this bill on those sections, the pieces about access, the return of ballots, to Representative Higley's point, if the miscellaneous bill goes down in flames, we'll have other elections bills that will come through, and I'll make sure that that's a priority, because that testimony we heard yesterday was very compelling. But yeah, Representative Hooper.
Well, that example of Franklin County that you used, also in the back of the mind, that continues to seem to me like party governance, not state dictate in terms of finding a solution to it. Like, party decides that a candidate no longer meets their qualifications. George Stephanopoulos, or whatever his name was in New York, party should have a mechanism where they can meet and withdraw.
So the challenge there, and I agree with you, I really deeply agree with that. The challenge there, though, is that we deeply care about, and I've heard of the committee discussion, we care about having open primaries. A lot of Vermonters really expect that. Didn't want to change that in this bill. And we deeply care about the will of the voters, right? And so if the voters said in the primary that that's the candidate they wanted, and then we allowed parties to second guess the voters after the primary, I think a lot of Vermonters would have real deep concern about that. I mean, even the idea that Chair Dane brought up, the chair of the GOP, of having like what Connecticut has, where there's sort of like a primary plus where you get sort of a check mark, or like I don't know that Vermonters would feel good about us asking the Secretary of State to do that. So I come back to the place where the viable thing, I think where if we want to make some improvement, is to just make the threshold higher. And that was the crux of H97. Representative Waters Evans.
Yes.
Have a comment?
I have so many comments. I just don't know which.
We got a few minutes here before
to comment on first. Which lane are we driving in right now? Tell me which.
We're just talking about the whole bill, so
Oh, okay. Well,
please feel free.
We have how many minutes until lunch?
Yeah, no. We've got 6 minutes until we have a bill introduction on something completely different.
My main point is this, or my main sort of struggle that I'm having is that I think, like especially yesterday when we were talking about military personnel overseas voting and people with disabilities being able to vote, either remotely or electronically or in their own voting station. Those are the things I think that are important as far as elections are concerned, because in my mind, voting, elections, all of these things are the whole point of having any laws surrounding it is to make it easier, more accessible, and more fair, and to encourage as many people as possible to vote and give them access to those things and make it equitable, right? And so for me, a little bit of the struggle, and I think it's a little bit of the struggle is that I feel fundamentally conflicted about placing any limits on any of these things at all, like more than what exists already. I'm not saying I know, I just saw your eyebrows go like that.
Because we already have minimum thresholds for being nominated.
I'm saying additional. I'm not saying we should just scrap this altogether and have a free for all. That's not what I'm saying at all. But what I'm saying is, I think if we're going to move in a direction, then we should move in a direction of making things easier for people to run for office, easier for people to vote for the people that they want to vote for, and easier and just have everything clear and more accessible. You know what I mean? Because maybe it is a little confusing, but I don't see or hear any confusion from voters about when they go to vote and they're like, what is this? Why do I only get a primary ballot? What I hear people say and when I see people write things in is, I know that I'm a Democrat, so I can only vote for Democrats in the primary, but I just want to write this person's name down because I want to use my voice. So if it's annoying for the town clerks, I'm sure if your voice is like, I want Justin Timberlake to be the Secretary of State, super aggravating, right? I totally get it. But I was just saying earlier, and I would like to just say officially that the town clerk in Charlotte is amazing, and I understand. All the town clerks are awesome.
None of us ever want to anger our town. I think we've made that very clear.
Which is why we're actually having this conversation.
It's not a town clerk issue,
Because
but
clerks are.
the backbone. I understand completely the hard work and stuff, but I'm saying for me a little bit, it's like I'm a bus driver, but sometimes it's annoying when people get on a bus in the way that I don't like them to. And unfortunately, that's part of the job as being a bus driver, right? Is that like someone might walk up the stairs backwards. You know what, am I making an analogy here? You understand?
I think
So as annoying
literally
as
have
it
people
is
walk up the
for
stairs
the town clerks to have to write down Justin Timberlake and then all the other members of NSYNC, that's part of the job because it's part of our system. It's part of our, it's our democracy. You know what I'm saying? So that's why putting any restriction on those things, and I understand that these are only for state elections, correct?
No. The write-in provisions go, we have, that's why there are multiple sections. So I want to, that should be really clear.
I'm glad I asked.
Yeah, so the write-in consent form, we propose that to be the 5 o'clock Friday before the election for presidential primary, statewide primary, and general elections, and then day of for local elections.
Yes.
So that the proposal that's in front of us has that write-in consent process for all of our elections as it's written in the bill right now.
So then that brings up the other problem, which is that the primary system, or these primary elections are party driven, right?
So what I would say more accurately is that in law, since for over 100 years in Vermont, the state has run the major parties' primary elections because parties used to have caucuses where just the party insiders picked their candidates, and then those were the candidates on the ballot. And I think we deeply value in modern electoral thinking and in modern American politics generally, the idea that the selectorate, the people who choose the candidates, I'm a deep poli-sci nerd, the selectorate is big, right? We want to have everybody who affiliates with a party, thinks about a party, and in Vermont, it's so open that really it's anybody who wants to vote in that party's primary that August gets to choose who the candidates are. I mean, that we have it wide open. So, yeah.
and there's the inherent conflict, right? Which is that it's, the primary is all about the parties, but at the same time, we want to keep it as loose party-wise as possible, and that's the tension, right, between these two ideas, which is that it's inherently about what party are you, but also restricting what party a person could be chosen as. And when we say things like, is this person, actually a Democrat if they're running as a Democrat or whatever, that's not up to the party. In my mind, I think it's up to the person running and the people voting for them.
Yeah, and I think, and I guess I would just ask before we move on and take a break from this.
Yes.
Given what's in the bill now, if we look at just raising the minimum threshold, that's still the voters deciding who the party nominee is in that party primary. There's nothing about that part has changed in this bill. It's still the voters. The only difference is that the person has to
More of
sign
them.
in order to automatically get a second nomination. Yes. All right. I believe we're gonna just take a break and we will come back to this after lunch. I'm gonna do some deep thinking and you all have given me a lot to think about. We're having fun here, Representative Sims.
We're fist bumping.
We're deep. No, we're deep. No. We're deeply appreciative of the opportunity to cleanse our palate and think about something else. So if you want to take the witness chair, Will and Tim, invite you guys to come back. We're not going to talk about the elections bill anymore until we come back at 1. So thank you so much for being here. Okay. All right, everybody. So we're going to take a deep breath. We've been doing some deep thinking about elections.
And how do you think about climate?
Yeah.
Talk about a special fund.
We have been busy in House Gov.Ops and Military Affairs and tried to get Representative Sims yesterday. I got stuck in traffic. There was a lot going on in Ways and Means, as there always is. So really appreciate you being flexible and working with us on the schedule. So Representative Sims, please tell us about H105.
Thank you, Chair and Committee. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here with you all. I'm Representative Sims from Orleans 4, Albany, Crestbury, Greensboro, Glover. And I appreciate the opportunity to be here with you all talking about H105, which is the act relating to Community Resilience and Disaster Mitigation Fund. And the purpose of the bill is to create the Community Resilience and Disaster Mitigation Fund to provide funding to municipalities for disaster mitigation and community resilient infrastructure. So to kind of frame how I got to think about this, bring you back to this summer. I don't know if folks remember, there was like a week when we had really high heat. And there were warnings about what to do to be safe during that time. And during that period, I went to the Vermont Department of Health's website that had a statewide map of all the cooling sites. And I looked in my region, the Northeast Kingdom. We got 55 towns. Just take a minute to guess how many cooling sites you think might have been on that map for that region. The answer was none. There were a few lakes listed. And as I was thinking about my elderly neighbor who's wheelchair bound, I was like, well, I guess I could figure out how to get them in the car and drive them down through the sand, into the water, but doesn't really feel sufficient to take care of people. And I'm really worried that we're not prepared for the impacts of extreme weather on our communities. And if we don't prepare now, we're going to leave, especially our most vulnerable, behind. So as you all know, climate change is a fundamental threat to our economy, our environment, and our way of life. Over the last 40 years, there have been large-scale shifts in our weather patterns, including a measurable increase in the number of catastrophic weather events. Our state is becoming warmer and hotter. And with those escalating weather extremes, where we have record temperatures and record rainfall events, they are having increased impacts on property losses. So from 2010 to 2019, extreme weather caused $69 million in insured losses across Vermont, impacting about 12% of policypayers. And our local municipalities are really the front lines of responding to these challenges. And although we have state and federal funding that is routinely made available to help communities after an event, to recover and respond to that disaster, there is no long-term consistent source of funds to support investments needed to prevent disasters from happening and mitigate the impacts of those disasters. So again, we're paying a lot now after the fact to clean up. We are not making available those resources up front to help plan. And so what this bill does is it establishes the Community Resilience and Disaster Mitigation Fund to award grants to municipalities to provide support for those disaster mitigation activities. So that might be slope stabilization, watershed restoration, drought mitigation, grid hardening, which I think many Vermonters can relate to who spent many days without power because of events that we've had this winter already. Or, other activities that would directly reduce, the risk to communities' lives and property and decrease costs associated with recovery from events. And so revenue for the fund would be generated by increasing the assessment on certain casualty insurance company premiums. The funding would be awarded to municipalities with priority for projects that use funding to match other grants, for projects that are in town hazard mitigation plans, and projects that are in communities that are identified as high on the Municipal Vulnerability Index. So right now we're working hard to create this Municipal Vulnerability Index, which will show which communities are at most risk, and that's where it stops. Right now, we don't have a next step for those communities that are identifying as vulnerable. And this bill seeks to address that. And I do want to be clear that this, yes, has a cost, but there is also a cost to doing nothing. Making upfront investments will decrease losses that would otherwise be largely paid by insurers and policyholders. And so, we're having a lot of conversations in this building about what Vermont can and should do to decrease our emissions. And I really support those conversations. Also think that it's essential that we work on resilience and adaptation. Even if we stop burning fossil fuels today, we will still experience more and more severe weather events. And we need to be planning for that now. And we must do it in a way that leaves no community behind. Again, we can usually access FEMA dollars to clean up after a disaster. And we've had a flood resilient community program in the past to help with flood mitigation, but just flood. And there's a lot of additional mitigation activities that our communities will benefit from investing in now. And so this provides this long-term consistent source of funding to make sure that communities are helping to prevent disasters. So, critical support, I think, especially to our most vulnerable in this time. And I know that you have a lot of bills on your wall, although it sounds like maybe you need a distraction from some of those other bills. So I might, Your presence is I can think of nothing more important than making sure that our communities are prepared for a changing climate that is here. And I hope that you'll consider taking up this bill, and I would be happy to answer any questions about it.
Representative Byron, I have a quick question. I'm gonna go last. Okay. No, I want to thank you for putting this in here. One of the, the Global Warming Solutions Act had two parts to it, right? And this is one of the pieces, was the being more prepared for the weather that is here and the severity of incoming weather over the years that will continue to be burdensome and catastrophic. So, thank you for that. This is something I genuinely believe we need to start taking a harder look at. My question for you within the context of this, though, is could you just explain a little bit more in depth about the funding mechanism coming off the existing insurance market structure?
Yeah, happy to dive into that. So the bill does include a one-time investment from our, one-time general fund surplus to sort of seed that fund. And then additional revenue would come from 32 VSA 8557, the Vermont Fire Service Training Council. And so that is a fund that is currently assessed on all insurance companies that write fire, homeowner, multiple peril, allied lines, farm owners, multiple, a sort of long list of sort of
catastrophic coverage.
Yep. And the current assessment raises 1.3 million, and 1.2 of that goes to the Fire Safety Special Fund, which I believe provides education and training and support for fire services, and then 150,000 goes to the Emergency Medical Services Special Fund. And what this bill does is it increases the assessment on those same insurance companies to generate 4.3 million. So the 1.3 million would continue to go to the Fire Safety Special Fund and the EMS Special Fund. So those would stay as they are with their current allocation. And then the additional 3 million would go into a new Community Resilience Disaster Mitigation Fund that would be used and made available through grants to municipalities to make those investments that would mitigate disaster and ultimately reduce costs for insurance companies and insurers and policyholders.
Okay. No, that was very detailed, but I continue going. So would that be sort of just like one of my overarching life philosophies is like plan for the worst, hope for the best, which is, I think, is a philosophy that needs to be applied in the overarching context of this. Do I have a last question to that? No, I'm going to stop and marinate. I'm done. Thank you. So Representative Sims, I understand the fund and what it's for, and I understand the funding mechanism you described, although if we were to take up this bill further, I'm sure that it would come right up to your committee and you all would decide actually how to fund it. So I'm less concerned about the funding mechanism because that's not our wheelhouse here. I am wondering who would decide how to spend the money that's in the fund?
Yeah. So I think we have a model. So we have had in the past with kind of one-time ARPA dollars, the Community Flood Resiliency Program, which was managed by State Emergency Management Division. And so they stood up a fund. You can, there would be certain criteria, communities would apply. If you met that criteria, you would be eligible to be awarded a grant. And so I think we have, within existing state government, agencies in place with expertise managing funds around disaster mitigation, who would stand up the program, determine the eligibility, the application process, and award those funds. Again, my suggestions were that we prioritize projects that were leveraging other dollars, like other FEMA grants, were included in town hazard mitigation plans, and or had a high rating on the Municipal Vulnerability Index, which is a tool that has been put together by the Climate Council. So, knowing that, we could never fund everything, try to prioritize the planning work that's already happening on the ground in all of our towns. So I'll stop there.
So we're going to hear next week about a more administrative and committee setup issue with the regional emergency management committees that we set up in the previous biennium. And so I had wanted to think about them in the context of this. Have you thought about how they might interface in that process of figuring out?
Yeah. I think that's a great question for them. I think there are a lot of partners who would have really great input about how to structure this work. I think what I experience in my communities is often we have no shortage of projects that we have identified as a need. And what we often lack are both the capacity to, apply for funds and manage those projects and access to the resources. The reason my community isn't ready for severe weather isn't because we don't necessarily know what to do. It's that we lack the resources to do that. And I think there are lots of partners who have the expertise, who know what our community should be doing. I imagine, the groups that you just mentioned would be a part of that. And this gives them a tool to actualize that we know we need to do now.
Any other questions for Representative Sims? Representative Wiki?
I just want to share my support for this. And I can relate to 2 years ago, that summer when we had 18 inches of rain in July. And one night in our town, we had 8 inches of rain, wiped out 13 roads, including a bridge that wound up costing $500,000 to replace. And we still haven't received FEMA money. We were promised 2 years later. And the other piece that happened that I think makes it easy to rationalize asking insurance companies is I was inundated with calls from people whose insurance companies turned down their claims to repair driveways, to repair culverts, to other storm-related damage. And I've lost count of how many storms of the century we've had already in this century. And I think this is a realization of the reality we're in. And this is going to help recognize that. And I'm hoping we can support this.
Thank you. Yeah, my small town is on its third $1 million bridge on the same section of road. And again, really worried about what happens to Vermonters at the end of long dirt roads when they're without power for a week. And how we're making sure that there are places that people can go to stay warm or to stay cool when they need to. And maybe even figuring out how to make sure that we're hardening our grid so it goes out less often.
Well, Representative Sims, thank you very much. I'll be thinking about this when we hear from the REMCs next week. And I think we really do need to figure out how we make sure that communities have the capacity. We've already done a little bit of work on that with our support for the rural municipal capacity grants and the BAA. And I think this is going to be the way that we do make sure that our communities have access to the programs and resources that we create, and whether we have enough resources for them to access is going to be a key question that keeps rolling forward. So this is an important piece for us to be thinking about in our Gov.Ops world here. So thank you very much for being with us today.
Appreciate it. Glad to provide a distraction from other.
Yeah, it was good to get out of the elections world, get in our public safety world. Thanks.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
All right, committee. So that is all we have on the agenda before lunch. I am going to have us all come back and we'll continue our work working on the elections bill. And I am working with a couple of folks to try to come up with a way to thread the needle on the domestic violence fatality review recommendations. So I'm hoping that I'll be able to put something before the committee, if not at the end of our session this afternoon before 4 tomorrow. And with that, we will adjourn from